One of the things that my dad taught me is sort of the artistic aesthetic end of things. And that comes in the form of making trails so you can't see from the top to the bottom, but there's discovery around every corner, or leaving islands of evergreens in the middle of the trail. We're really helping the general public access nature.
Welcome to the storm. I'm your host, Stuart Winchester. As you may have noticed, I am obsessed with lift surf ski areas, and in particular, how they evolved from raw wilderness into these ski centers that mean so much to us. Frankly, I view ski areas as works of art, which means they have an artist or a creator behind them. And one of the principal creators of our ski experience over the past 4 decades will join me today to talk about how it's done. First, you probably know by now that you can watch the Storm Skiing podcast. It's on YouTube at Storm Ski Journal. It's on stormskiing.com. You can watch it on the Substack app by following the Storm Skiing Journal and podcast. You can also still listen on all your audio platforms, and you always will be able to. But the video pod adds a little context. It's like a little TV show. There's photos, there's trail maps, all kinds of stuff interspersed, and I think you will really like it. And of course, there are many ways you can support the Storm. Please give me a follow on X or Instagram at Storm Ski Journal. If you're really digging the brand, you can rep it by popping over to the Storm store at stormskiing.myshopify.com, where you can pick up a hat, hoodie, shirt, sticker, and a bunch of other stuff. But the very best way to support the Storm's mission of independent ski journalism is to upgrade to the paid tier of the Storm Skiing Journal and podcast, which will get you access to 100% of the Storm's written content, past and present. You know who else supports the Storm? My friends at Profile Search International. Look, you are about to hear a conversation with one of the best minds in skiing. But Chris Cushing has a job, and I don't get the sense that he is going anywhere anytime soon. However, there is a ton of ski industry talent out there that is looking to make a move. And as you know, they could change your entire operation. The folks at Profile Search International are the ski industry talent acquisition experts. They are the only executive search and recruitment firm in the world that is 100% focused on the ski industry. Profile Search has used their intimate understanding of skiing and related industries and of available candidates worldwide to place hundreds of transformational leaders at the best and most progressive ski areas for more than 30 years. With offices in the US and Canada, Profile Search can find and negotiate with the right leaders for your team. You can reach out to them directly at profilesearch.com or contact them by email or phone, or you can send me a note and I will connect you directly with this expert team. All right, let's get into episode 206 of the Storm Skiing Podcast. Chris Cushing, Principal of Mountain Planning at SE Group. My guest today is Principal of Mountain Planning at SE Group, a multidisciplinary outdoor recreation planning and design firm that has assisted in the planning, design, and operation of thousands of mountain resorts, public lands, and communities across the globe. He joined Snow Engineering in 1985 and has worked on and led projects throughout North and South America, China, Europe, Iceland, Japan, South Korea, Turkey, Australia, and Asia. Chris Cushing is my guest. Chris, welcome to the Storm. I feel like this interview will help everyone understand the 200 ski area interviews that came before it. So maybe I should have started with you, but so glad to have you here today. How you doing today, Chris?
Doing well, Stuart. Thanks for having me. I look forward to chatting with you.
So I want to start with your winter so far. It hasn't been as good as maybe 2 winters ago, but where are you based? You've been able to get out skiing. Where you been?
Yeah. So I'm based in Salt Lake, so I've got some really great options for skiing out the back door here. It's actually been a pretty good season for me so far. I think my third day of skiing for the season was heli skiing with a good friend of mine up in Alaska. So that was a good way to kind of kick things off. Get down to Mammoth when they had the big storm about a month or so ago. Got about 4 feet of snow over there, which was great. And then more recently, when my wife and I went over to Lech in St. Anton in Austria, spent a week over there. So Alta, Snowbird, Deer Valley are my ski areas of choice in this neighborhood, and skiing's been real good this year.
How long have you been in Salt Lake, Chris? And what was it like getting up into the canyons when you first moved there?
Hmm. Well, I first lived here in 85 or 84, 85. I came out here after I graduated from UVM, and back then it was nothing. We moved here. Yeah, getting up the canyon was like not an issue at all. And then we moved here permanently in '02. And even then, it was never a factor of whether you'd find a parking space or that there would be the red, what do they call it? The red dragon. What do they call it? The
Red snake is what I hear, but what do I know?
red snake, red dragon. Come on.
I like the red
snake,
dragon
yeah.
better, actually.
Actually, it's funny. The UTA transit buses now have shrink wrap on them that says something like "Red Snake Pace Car." But anyway, none of that was the case back even in '02. It's only been I mean, let's face it, the Icon Pass has just changed the industry so dramatically and epic. And I think that, that's when Snowbird and Alta went on the Icon, is when things got, sort of one step more difficult to get up the canyons. And it's been great for skiers and the resorts. The Icon Pass has been such a phenomenal success and so helpful to get people out skiing and so forth. But they're the consequences, and that's one of them.
You've had a good long time to see the scale of change in Utah. And you mentioned you grew up in the East. Take us back here because I want to get your full story before we talk about mountain planning. So I want to plant that context with the listeners here. So you grew up where, like Boston area skiing, upper New England? Where did you grow up and where did you grow up skiing?
I actually grew up in Franconia, New Hampshire, northern New Hampshire, which is there's Cannon Mountain. So I grew up, which is where Bodie came from, Bodie Miller. So I learned to ski. There's a little ski resort next to Cannon, Mittersill, which is where I literally learned how to ski at age 3. And then grew up skiing and racing at Cannon. I went to school at a prep school down in Plymouth, New Hampshire called Holderness School. Which has a pretty good reputation for racing. And then, I went to UVM, University of Vermont, when I graduated from high school and skied. And, one of the primary reasons I went to UVM is that there's good skiing within 45 minutes, little options, and ended up skiing at Stowe for my tenure at UVM, I was on the 6-year plan at UVM. Before I went into college, so my dad was a part of snow engineering, and I ultimately actually went on a couple of field trips with my dad, laying out ski trails and things. And so when I was going into college, I was like, "Gee, Dad, what should I do to become a ski area planner?" And he said, "Well, get a degree in civil engineering." So that's what I did, and like I said before, after I graduated, I came out here to Utah, hang out with a buddy of mine and kind of ski bum and that kind of thing for a year. And while I was here, I got a call from my dad and he said, "Hey, our snowmaking engineer needs a junior engineer to help him out. Are you interested?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And so I started with the company in '85 and doing the snowmaking engineering. And then, I always wanted to get into the ski planning piece. And in '87, one of our former leaders, Tim Beck, I think a lot of people on your podcast may know Tim Beck. He was really involved in skiing in terms of coaching being with our company and with Vail and so forth. And he at the time decided to take some time off to do some real estate development. And so an opening came up to do the ski planning, which I jumped on, and it just stayed with it ever since.
So I would imagine that when you came into that, you had a certain set of biases based on who you were as a skier and what you like to ski. At least that's probably how I would approach it. And you step into what is at that point an established profession, an established company in snow engineering. So take us into this as much as you can, Chris. When you stepped into this mountain planning space back in the mid 80s or whenever it was that you took that job you just described, what were the priorities around mountain planning as far as the ski experience went in building that for the average lift serve skier? And how did that fit into what you wanted to do and what you thought that the vocation should be focusing on?
Yeah, the one of the things that the people that taught me, my mentors, my dad, this guy Tim Beck, and others, was the importance of seeing our design through the eyes of the general public skier, and how important it is to not design for what I like necessarily, but what the general skier population likes. And it's a bell curve. The beginners are about 20%, intermediates are 50, and experts 30, give or take. And it's really important to be aware of that. And so that was kind of drilled into my head early on. And so I really took that to heart and recognized the importance of that. When I first started in the mid late 80s is when detachable lifts were first being introduced in North America, and that was a really big part of the work we did is looking at the impacts of high speed lifts and higher capacity, higher hourly capacity, which puts more skiers on the trails, and skiers being able to get their day in more quickly because they're getting their vertical feet skied more quickly. And so a lot of the work we did was looking at that and with higher lift capacities, again, putting more people on the terrain, we were starting to look at ways of expanding the terrain, not only adding acreage, but also, improving the capabilities of the terrain by smoothing the ground and making it more easy to groom the snow, and those types of things. It was just really quite a pretty transformational time of the business, because again, you had high speed lifts, you had huge improvements to grooming machinery, and snowmaking was really evolving at the time. So there was just a lot more there are a lot of changes. It was really quite transformational. It was really fun to be a part of that.
Let's talk about the lifts first here, Chris. I'll give you several examples of how lift fleets have consolidated over the years, and I'll do that because I'm not sure which ones you've worked on. So I'll throw a couple out there, and you can either run with those or give me examples of ones that you may have been involved with. So a couple years ago, we had the Highlands, owned by Boyne Resorts, took out 3 triple chairs, put in 1 6-pack, right? So your on mountain footprint severely reduced. Mountain Creek, which was known as Vernon Valley Great Gorge, owned at the time by IntraWest, took out, I don't have the exact number, something like a dozen lifts, and put in 3 or 4, 2 high-speed quads, a cabriolet, changed the name of Mountain Creek from Vernon Valley Great Gorge. And then Kimberly up in BC had 4 frontside lifts, put in 1 high-speed quad, took out all the rest. So those are all examples of important ski areas in important markets that went from a bunch of lifts to fewer lifts, but to your point, putting more skiers on the hill. So as you think back in your career, can you point to some places where you were involved in those sorts of footprint rearrangements and how you approach that process and the impact it would have on the mountain?
Yeah, yeah. The one classic example of what you're talking about, it was actually a new resort, Revelstoke, up in British Columbia. We were involved in the planning of that. I think I started working on that in '92 or something like that. Revelstoke's a huge mountain. It's got 600 feet of vertical and thousands of acres of terrain, but it's remote. It's hard to get to. And so when we kind of put together a master plan for the ultimate build out of the resort. But the ownership, and we recognized that it would be tough to get a significant amount of skier visitation over the course of a year, given the location. So, when we looked at the first phases of how to build out that mountain, it was like, okay, we've got this big, huge mountain. How do we serve it with the least number of lifts possible? And that was like the challenge of the project is figuring out how to do that. And I think, well, as you may know, there's Revelstoke's, I think it's like 3,500 acres of terrain, and it's served by 5 lifts. And that's, Deer Valley is 2,000 acres of terrain served by 21 lifts.
Right.
So, that's a classic example. But there are many other examples that, of existing resorts that, Steamboat is a great example where there, is the Priest Creek and Sundown shares that were basically parallel one another. And so that was a kind of a no-brainer of replacing those 2 lifts with one high-speed lift. And it's a very, very common situation, throughout the industry.
So as these lifts get more sophisticated, as your planning gets more sophisticated, you go to this footprint where you try to design it right according to the technology at the time. Sometimes, though, bigger is not always better, right? So you have a situation like Big Sky where, yes, they want 10,000 seats out of the base. They put an 8-pack, a 6-pack, to putting in a 10-person gondola. On the other side, you have an Arapahoe Basin, right? Which, when they went and replaced their, what's the name of the double chair? I'm blanking on it right now. A couple of years ago, they what's that?
Lenawee.
Well, the Lenawee, they turned into a 6, so they went from 3 to 6. But then on the other side of the mountain, they had
Pallavicini.
Yeah, the Pallavicini. They took that double chair and they replaced it with another double chair. So that was a resort that seems very invested in, yes, the throughput and the skiers and getting people up the mountain in a modern, comfortable way, but also recognizing what it is and wanting to retain that through the infrastructure design. Curious about your insights there. And Crystal Mountain in Washington did the same thing. They opened up that great, I think it's North Country or whatever, and they put a double chair up there when they probably could have put a 6-pack, but they decided not to.
Yeah. And that's a big part of it is what's the kind of the philosophy of the ski area? Clearly A Basin is, it's the legend. It's it's A Basin. I mean, what more do you need to say? And Alan Henseroth, the COO up there, he really is, he like lives that so passionately and recognizes that vibe that they have is what makes them a great resort and so popular. There's other examples of that as well. Like you mentioned, Mad River Glen, they replaced a single chair with a single chair because that's their thing, right? And that's what we all have to be aware of that. And different resorts have different things that are their differentiator, and it's really important not to lose sight of that and to recognize things that and when they when A Basin put in the 6-pack. It was a big, we had a lot of conversations about that. And because basically 6-pack is really good application for that lift because there's some wind issues at the top, and 6-pack chairs operate much more consistently in higher winds. And I don't want to speak for Alan or the other folks at A Basin, but I think that was a real driver for them is the, being able to operate in the higher wind condition. But the locals, the A Basin skier, they're like, "What? You're putting in a 6-pack? How can you do that?" And a lot of people don't recognize that you can put in a 6-pack and have it run at the same hourly capacity as a double chair, and the chairs are just spaced farther apart. But that gets lost in translation, and with so many of these controversial issues that are out there, there's a lot of misinformation that gets spread around, But anyway, that was a really big decision for Alan and his team as to whether they actually do a 6-pack or not.
I don't want to get too hung up on A Basin because I actually do have Al coming back on the podcast in a few weeks here, but it's just
cool.
Such an interesting mountain from a planning point of view, because if you look at their Beavers expansion that they did a few years ago, it's about 1,500 vertical feet, and you go with a fixed grip lift there, a fixed grip quad, and you decide to land the lift higher on the mountain. You have the steep gullies down below, and you want people to have to hike out of that. I don't know if you were involved in that project or if you can talk through the process of thinking, okay, we want to make it bigger, but we don't want to make it so big that people either get in trouble or we ski the steep gullies out or whatever. I'm not sure what your process was there.
Yeah, and it's kind of something that I think about a lot is we have these areas that we ski, and it's great powder skiing, and it's like, man, I wish there was a lift up here. Well, as soon as you put a lift there, it's not powder anymore. It's moguls, So, and that was, I think, the primary driver for A Basin to not lift serve the steep gullies is, first of all, it's pretty intense terrain, and you don't really want to kind of pump people in there. But more importantly, it would get skied out so quickly that it kind of loses the allure. And so that's something that we consider a lot when we're looking at expanding areas, and like Peak 6 at Breckenridge. Well, we probably couldn't have taken that lift all the way to the ridge because of the wind up there. But one of the benefits of ending the top of the lift below the ridge line is that people can hike from there to the ridge and ski the chutes and things. And again, because it's not directly lift served, it preserves the powder a little bit longer and makes it more of a kind of a more fun experience. And that's what it's all about is having that variety. You want to give people all kinds of different things to do, whether it's skiing groomers or moguls or trees or powder. It's all about trying to create the variety within the context of the resort.
So to look at that from the other end of where folks didn't want to lift, but the resort put one anyway. I was skiing Taos earlier this week, rode the Kachina Peak lift, beautiful piece of real estate, just spectacular. And personally, I like it. I like being able to have that experience. The fellow I was skiing with had been skiing Taos since the 70s, and so he'd seen the whole evolution of it. And he kind of took me through the locals' point of view. And he said, yeah, people have gotten used to it, but the truth is this face, Kachina Peak, never had moguls on it. The day they opened this lift, it had moguls on it, and it's had it ever since. Not in any way trying to call out Taos. I think they do a great job. But do you look at projects like that, like Kachina Peak, and say, okay, well, they put the triple chair there. It's not going anywhere. But maybe that'll help us decide if we put a lift up, I don't know, Highlands Bowl at Aspen Highlands, right? Which right now is hike 2, and it's great, but it would change the character of it immediately if you put a lift up there.
Yeah. And, with Taos, there's so much good steep terrain and glades and things like that there. And I'm sure that had a lot to do with the decision of doing the Kachina Peak lift. It's like, well, man, we got all this terrain that's kind of not the same, but similar to Kachina Peak. And so, okay, let's lift serve this particular area because it is a little bit more difficult to get to, hiking. But again, there's just so much of that type of terrain available at Taos. I suspect that had something to do with it. And that's, certainly from my perspective, that's what I would consider.
So we're seeing a couple of extremes in the way that resorts think about chairlifts. And for a long time, you had that high speed quad, and that became the standard. Now, I was counting it up the other day. We've had just an enormous number of six packs go in over the past few years. And you've had Boyne Resorts, which is really invested in these high speed eight packs and some just spectacular D line lifts. They're so much fun to ride. They're like an experience. You ski into the house and there's video screens and I just love it as much as I love the single chair at Mad River Glen. On the other end, it seems as though we're seeing a moderate comeback in surface lifts just because they're so cost effective. For example, Waterville Valley at the top, they put in a new T-bar, 700 grand or something like that, instead of having to replace an old chairlift. Lots of wind up there, so T-bars obviously are much more wind resistant. And another project I saw SE was involved on was Highland Hills, Minnesota, where they have all these high-speed rope tows and the kids do nothing but lap parks all day. Curious about your thoughts on either end of the lift fanciness spectrum, we'll call it, of if we're starting to find where the right lift for the right situation, more than just saying a high speed quad should go here because a high speed quad is a thing. Whereas at Boyne or a Big Sky, yeah, it makes sense to have those spectacular lifts because you're paying $1 million to be there. At Highland Hills, Minnesota, it's all 12-year-old kids who want to jump off things. So no, you probably don't want any chairlifts. So what are your thoughts on that and kind of if we're getting to a better equilibrium of how we think about lifts along the spectrum?
Yeah, yeah. The Highland Hills example it's just when we started doing work there, one of my colleagues was there at the resort and was taking some video of their terrain park. And she sent me the video, and I honestly thought that it was on fast forward because the rope tows were going so fast. I couldn't believe it. And yeah, they have the snowboarders have a berm at the bottom of the hill, and they just come in and go around the berm and start going back up the hill and grab onto the rope, and they're just laughing. It's classic, and that's such a great example of using a lift that is really appropriate for the specific case. And Highland Hills, I think it's 125 feet of vertical or something like that. And so those high speed rope tows are perfect. It's a low cost installation. They can put up, however many they want. It accounts for the short slope. I mean, these kids are just going in laps. So, instead of doing 600 vertical feet of terrain park, they're doing 100 and then 100 and then 100 there's a lot of examples of where surface lifts have been kind of the preferred choice.
So one of the most fascinating examples to me because lifts are very expensive today, right, is Sunrise Park, Arizona had this triple chair. It was the longest triple chair anywhere, Cyclone triple, and it broke down years ago, and it was just sitting there. And then they finally took it out and they put in just a rope tow from their Apache Peak, kind of where you ski down some of these green runs, up to the top of Cyclone. And it changed that from where folks had to hike to it's lift served. I mean, they probably spent like $70,000 on this rope tow. I don't know how much, I'm just guessing. But it solved that problem without having to put in a $9 million lift, which is probably what Cyclone would have cost. Are you seeing more of these? And I don't know if you're involved in Sunrise at all, but are you seeing more of these inventive sort of low cost solutions where ski areas are getting creative because they don't have the $8, $9, $10 million for a new lift, but they can solve the terrain problem with just a little imagination and money?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that. I mean, like you say, the cost for detachable lifts has just skyrocketed, there's tons of them being installed on an annual basis. It's staggering the number of lifts that are being installed even this coming winter or coming summer. But some of the smaller resorts, it's just gotten, it's priced them out of the game. And so, using fixed grip chairlifts is becoming a little bit more common. And yeah, the kind of solutions you're talking about of rather than providing direct chairlift access to terrain, but either creating skiways or transfer tows or things like that to get people into that terrain, and then they can kind of a two lift scenario it is a very cost effective way. And again, when you put getting back to my earlier comment of putting direct lift access, that a lot of terrain can compromise it to a certain degree. And so, yeah, and there's no, I wouldn't say there's any trend necessarily in that direction of doing more creative solutions, but it's definitely out there, and I think we'll probably be seeing a lot more of that. Which I think you see over in Europe, and you get a lot of that type of thing. I mean, like I say, I was just over in Lech, and one of the primary ways to get between Lech and St. Anton or Zers is, you ride at this aerial tramway, then you ski down to a point. You have to ride this little T-bar that gets you up to a point that you can get over to the next place. And it's more common and more accepted in Europe. And I think over here, well, obviously our resorts aren't as big here as the bigger resorts in Europe. But I think that, we're just not accustomed to that kind of approach. And I think we'll be seeing a lot more of it.
I interrupt this conversation with Chris Cushing to bring you a note from my partner, Aspenware. Imagine a future where 99% of your mountain products are booked online. Aspenware is the leading e-commerce solution purpose-built for the ski industry. Aspenware creates customized e-commerce platforms that ensure resort guests spend more time doing what they love and less time standing in lines. Utilizing the team's extensive industry experience, Aspenware strives to make the resort booking process seamless with a mobile-friendly, simplified sales process that anticipates the needs of customers at every part of their journey. Based in Denver, Colorado, Aspenware stands apart as an innovator. They understand the value that software and technology bring to a mountain resort, and they strive to create solutions so good they seem invisible. Visit aspenware.com to learn more. All right, let's get back to Chris. I could ask you about chairlifts all day, but let me switch to the actual terrain, and I'll start with an observation from my own life as a skier. Again, to go back to your original point of you try to understand it as a recreational skier. So I started skiing in the 90s when I was a teenager, and I was living in the Lower Peninsula of Michigan where I grew up. And I don't believe, and I will double check this, that there was a single marked glade on any trail map in Michigan at the time. And I would go up to Searchmont in Ontario, and they did have that experience. Fast forward 30 years, and you have Mount Bohemia, which was built as nothing but glades. All of the big ski areas in Michigan, and really anywhere in America where there's enough snow to justify, and even places where there isn't, like Pennsylvania, have marked glades on the map. So can you talk about that thought evolution from, and I'd imagine there's a big liability component here, of we're just going to have runs on a hill, and they're either red, blue, or black, to we want this to be a more interesting experience where folks can go in the trees and feel invited. And it's not just, if you know, it's we're going to put on the map, like a Jay Peak or Steamboat. These are the glades. You can go in here, have fun. Just talk us through that long evolution from sort of this fringe thing that people could get kicked out for to being a major draw at a lot of ski areas with this gladed terrain.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest transition in the ski industry that we've seen, from our perspective and everyone's perspective. This desire for, side country or off-piste terrain. And, it really kind of evolved out of the alpine touring craze, took off, and it just became more accessible to get off the standard groomed runs and getting into powder skiing and so forth. Jackson Hole was one of the earlier resorts to allow people outside of their boundary and make it, like you say, it's not illegal anymore. And so it just sort of built on that. And now it's to the point where if a resort doesn't show some kind of glades or some other, alternative type terrain, that it causes them to not be quite as attractive. And so it's almost mandatory to have that kind of offering at your resort. And from a planning perspective, the way we approach that type of terrain is it's kind of ancillary to when we look at putting in a chairlift, we want to balance the uphill capacity of the lift with the downhill capacity of the train, so it's not too crowded and that type of thing. And we don't count glades and things in that analysis because it's not reliable terrain. You can't. You could have a holiday weekend, or a holiday, whatever day, and if the snow isn't good, or if it's the circumstances are such that you can't actually access those glades or bowls or whatever it is, then everyone has to be on the ski trails. And so we want to make sure that there's enough ski trails so that it doesn't get crowded under those circumstances. But I'm sort of digressing there. But yeah, it's, like you said, I mean, even back east, there's very few resorts that don't have some type of glade skiing shown on the trail map. And if they don't, for a lot of people, they might go somewhere else.
It's true. There's wide consensus that the best ski area in Pennsylvania is Elk Mountain. And I mostly agree with that. However, there's big signs all over the place that you're not allowed to ski in the trees. And I just find that so retrograde. And so I give the nod to Blue Knob, which will let you ski anywhere when they have the snow and when they're open top to bottom, which is a whole other thing. Related to glades, Chris, and a big change that I've observed, and again, I'll give this from my point of view, and I would love to hear your thoughts, is terrain parks. Because in when you started in the mid 80s, I don't think there were any terrain parks. And if they were highly specialized for things like Olympics. When I started skiing around 94, 95, they were snowboard parks. Skiers were not allowed in. We would crash them, and the snowboarders would yell at us. And there used to be this big skier snowboarder like thing that I think has mostly gone away. I'm you lived through it too, so And I saw everyone kind of get terrain parks, right? And there was half pipes everywhere. Now I'm kind of seeing the opposite, where most ski areas do have terrain parks, but some explicitly don't. And a lot of the big ski areas, like I was having a conversation with Tom Fortune at Heavenly when he was running that resort, and he said, I was watching the terrain park all winter. We had these huge hits. They're ungodly expensive to build. No one was hitting them. I made the terrain park manager smash them all down. I think he left, but what I'm seeing is on one end, you have places like Mammoth, Brighton, Copper Mountain, which are saying we are a park mountain, building half pipes, building huge complexes, building whole lifts dedicated to it. The other ski areas, even the major resorts, again, I was at Taos earlier this week, and they said we've really backed off it. It's expensive. This mountain's kind of a terrain park anyway. It's not really why people are coming here. It is very hard now to find a half pipe anywhere other than the places that I just mentioned, those big, Mount Hood, like the big places. So I'm really curious to hear from your perspective how terrain parks have evolved and been part of mountain planning. So they also take up a lot of real estate, right? So you have suddenly had to account for that. So curious to hear your thoughts on the evolution of them and where you think we are and where you think, if you can say, where you think we're going with the terrain parks.
Yeah, you pretty much nailed it on the head. Half pipes really are, you're not seeing, as you mentioned, you're not seeing a lot of half pipes anymore because they're really expensive to build. I mean, you have to make a lot, and you have to make the snow. You can't just use natural snow. When I was in Mammoth, they were building their half pipe, and it was just like hours and hours of groomer time and moving tons of metric ton of snow, and it's just super expensive. And even even the big hits, those are really expensive to build as well, and time consuming, and they take up space and so forth. The rail parks are a little bit easier to set up and maintain, and more people can kind of enjoy them. It's a little bit more available to a bigger population of riders, either snowboarders or skiers. I'm sure you've experienced this as well of being at a resort and they've spent millions of dollars or whatever building a half pipe, and there's never anyone in there. There's that gets very little use other than probably events and things. So yeah, I think that place Woodward, that it's a resort at Woodward Park City and also in Boreal. That's their thing. They are a terrain park area, and that's great. It's a great program for learning kids and people, introducing them to the notion of freestyle skiing and riding, and I think that's, it's such a great opportunity to get kids into the sport and passionate about it. So I think it's going to continue forward. I think that we probably will see fewer and fewer half pipes popping up, at resorts in general, and really more being concentrated on resorts that kind of like it is today. Um, but the parks, the rails and little hits and things like that, um, they're here to stay for sure. Because they again, it's all about the variety, right? You got to have everything. You got to have a little bit of everything, or a lot of one thing and some of the other. So it'll always be part of ski resorts.
It seems to me, Chris, that the phenomenon I was describing is a differentiation between large ski areas where snowbird's kind of like, oh, we don't need that. We have 500 inches of snow and awesome terrain, right? Where Brighton's like, well, we're competing with snowbird, we're right next door. What do we have, right? So, but on the smaller end, the Midwest ski areas that I remember skiing in the 90s, I mean, there were no jumps to be found. If you tried to build one, ski patrol would come yell at you and smash it down. And as a teenager, I started to lose interest very quickly. It's totally different now. You go to places like Trollhagen, Wisconsin, Wild Mountain, Minnesota, which are neighbors. They're all basically all parks. And in pretty much every Midwest ski area, other than like your Mount Bohemia, that's explicitly something else, has a really well-developed terrain park. How important do you think that the advent of terrain parks has been, not just to keeping skiers involved, but really to keeping the Midwest relevant as a ski culture and region?
Yeah. As the Midwest is a real incubator, or has been a real incubator for racing. And now that with I mean, the mountains are small, so from a recreational skiing perspective, it doesn't, it's a little bit more challenging to be engaged so back in the day it was people would race. It's like, okay, well, the recreational skiing is so, but if I'm racing, that's exciting. It's a good thing to do, and that's what the terrain parks have added is it's and I mean, obviously the recreational skiing has created those mountains, and they've done a phenomenal job of doing things to keep people motivated and energized and coming back for more. Adding the terrain parks, in addition to the racing, I think it had a lot to do with kind of the perpetuation of, or the growth of skiing in the Midwest, and even back in New England, a lot of the smaller resorts in New England, it's the same thing that without back in the whatever 70s, 80s, 90s, it was the racing programs that the kids would be in the racing programs, the parents would ski the mountain, and it really brought energy to those resorts like Cranmore, Black Mountain in New Hampshire. It's funny how I use examples from New Hampshire and you use examples from the Midwest,
Yeah.
because that's where we grew up.
Right.
But anyway, you get what I'm saying. It's these programs, whether it's racing or parks and freestyle, it's something that's attractive to kids and teenagers and so forth. It's like, oh yeah, I think I want to do that, and it's just keeping that growth happening.
All right. So moving on to the mountain as a whole, I'm curious, Chris, as you approach new projects and rework areas of existing mountains where you have a chance to rework these lifts, and often when you do a big project like that, you have a chance to redo some trails. And I'm thinking of examples like at Killington, maybe 5, 6 years ago, they put in 3 skier bridges that acted as intersections at particular trails, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but essentially it reduced collision points. And there's some ski areas I go to where this is still a big problem, and I know you won't call them out, but I can say specifically like Camelback, too many trails where there's too many inexperienced skiers just colliding together. So how much of your job is fixing past mistakes and trying to better segregate folks by where they should be on the mountain according to their ability and preventing bad collisions from happening that could if you didn't do something like those skier bridges at Killington.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of that. We actually did help Killington out with that. So Killington's an interesting case study. Press Smith, who developed Killington originally, his whole thing was he wanted to have beginner skiers be able to get to every peak on the mountain. And, that resulted in a lot of intersections and mixing of ability levels and things. And that's been, and we're working with Killington right now. I had a call with them yesterday to continue that work. It's, the things that happened back when a lot of these resorts were developed in the 60s and 70s, they did things that worked back then because, there was a tenth of the number of skiers on the mountain there was double chairlifts that are running at, very low capacity. And so a lot of our work is going back in, and they weren't mistakes. It was just, people were planning ski resorts for the times and what at the time made for a great experience. But things have changed, so a lot of it is, the tunnels at Killington were to address that exact situation of beginner skiers merging in with intermediate and expert skiers, and that was a solution to kind of ameliorate that. Steamboat, it's kind of the other side of the spectrum where, their big challenge over the years was that it's just one portal. There's just one base to get people up onto this huge mountain, and that was kind of the impetus for the whole Full Steam Ahead initiative. There is rebuilding their existing gondola and relocating the six pack, the Christie 6 that comes out of the base, and then adding a Wild Blue gondola. And again, it was back in the day when Steamboat was conceived. Having only one base was fine. It's like, no, we're never going to have. But as the resort grew and became more popular, and they got up to 1 million skier visits a year, things changed, and so there's just a whole myriad of things that influence how skiers work that we need to address, and a lot of them are just the way things were done back in the 70s and the way people are skiing mountains today. Sorry, I can't use any other good examples, but
let me ask you about another mountain that I think has done a good job of evolving its brand, and that's Jackson Hole, which is obviously an expert's mountain. But they've done a couple of things with the Timonat chair, with their Sweetwater gondola, with the mid-mountain learning terrain, and they've made it more so people like my wife. We went to Jackson late in 2023, and she was able to go take a few laps on Timonat. She would never have any interest in going up the tram other than as a sightseeing thing, and that's great. And they have that. At the same time, the mountain is very cut up by traverses because it's so steep, and that's the only way that you can really make that into a mountain that is in any way approachable to an intermediate skier. And they're still not down from the tram. You still have to take Black Diamonds, but I'm looking at the trail map right now, and it looks like if once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's like an interstate highway system across it, and it does cut up the experience a little bit. I'm curious about this problem. Maybe, I'm not sure if you've ever worked on Jackson, but how are you thinking about this problem of the mid-run traverse in the danger it causes and the inconvenience and the confusion? If it's not groomed and labeled right, it can be a big disaster.
I've been working with Jackson back when Paul McAllister owned the place. And back then that was kind of the focus of our efforts, was to, address the fact that it was an experts only mountain. And we introduced the whole idea of, we can't change the mountain but we can focus lift capacity on the more gentle terrain. So thus the replacement of Tiwanaut, Après-Vu, the Bridger gondola, I think it's called Teton, the new lift up in the Crags area, which is sort of intermediate-ish.
Yeah, that's Teton Quad.
Intermediate-ish. And so, that was kind of the approach, and it was obviously quite successful in terms of the resort being more, like you say, user-friendly to non-expert skiers. But those skiways, which have been there from day one, it's unfortunately it's a necessary evil. You have to, it's such a broad mountain, and it is important to link those lower, intermediate or novice areas. And again, it's just necessary. And because Jackson 2 comes down into a funnel, you don't want everyone having to go back to the bottom to get somewhere. They have to, kind of have to have them traverse higher up and not go back to the base because it would overcrowd the base area. So, essentially what we try to do in those cases where you do have to have those traverses is try to avoid having fall line ski runs that cross those skiways, or if there's that need, to make it more of a merge where the fall line trail comes in and then merges with the skiway and then peels off again. So instead of a real cross traffic, an X, it's more of a merging situation, which is possible sometimes and sometimes it's not. But certainly we try not to do that, and that's something that is one of the things that Killington has been grappling with over the past several years, is kind of getting away from those traverses and actually closing some trails and doing things to lessen the number of those types of traverses with crossings of fall line trails, but it's hard. You got you want to give people as many options as possible in terms of accessing the mountain for whether it's beginner or expert, but you have to balance that with how it might compromise the experience for others. So it can be tough sometimes, and Jackson is a really good example of where there's really not an option.
It's so interesting to watch the evolution of these mountains under these multi-mountain passes, because I feel to some extent some of the mountains are kind of doing what they did with terrain parks, which is trying to be all things to all skiers. And we do see some good expansions around skiing, and I believe you're involved with some of these that make a mountain a little more diverse. Like you have Bergman Bowl, which Keystone, which creates this great high elevation, high altitude terrain for intermediates. You have McCoy Park at Beaver Creek, which is a beginner pod at the top of the mountain, which is fantastic. And then you have Heroes over at Aspen, probably a mountain that didn't need a lot more expert terrain, but nonetheless they had it, and it was a nice expansion. And that's great when you have access to it and you can build it. But then you look at a mountain like Snowbird, and Snowbird I think is the best ski area along with Alta in the country. And just from a pure terrain point of view, I freaking love it. But when people are asking me for recommendations, I almost never tell them to go to Snowbird unless I know they are a very strong skier. Because yes, they have intermediates around, they have chips around. It's kind of boring. I don't really, it's like if I went there as an intermediate, I don't think I'd have a good time. I would want to go to Park City, right, or Deer Valley. So, to what extent, when you're looking and working with these mountains on these master plans, do you say lean into what you are? Be a Silverton, be a Mount Bohemia, or be a Buttermilk, right? Or you say, okay, Jackson or Snowbird or whatever, we'll find a way to make you have a little piece of beginner terrain. What are your thoughts there as far as that whole spectrum of some mountains just aren't beginner mountains?
Yeah, and and the mountains are what they are. You can't. I mean, you can do grading projects to do certain things, but for the most part, you really can't. You can't change the mountain, and there's things you can do to kind of mitigate circumstances, like, like I was saying at Jackson, starting with more capacity in the buttermilk. They have added some glade areas that are a lot of fun. And, actually buttermilk is becoming quite a popular resort for locals recently. Yeah, yeah. Um, so, yeah, I mean, you have to work with what you've got. The more you can cater to the widest cross section of people, the better. Snowbird is a really great example, and I share your counsel to friends is like, if you're an intermediate skier, yeah, you can definitely go up there. You'll have, it's beautiful. You'll have some great skiing, but it's not really the ideal place to go. And there's not a lot you can do about that. And we do a lot of work with those guys. And the Wilbur chair was replaced this past summer, and it kind of improves the situation for intermediate skiers. But it was mostly done for the racing community. That Bryce Astle Race Center. So there's things you can do to mitigate those circumstances of trying to be something for everybody. And in many cases it can work and really help and again, Jackson's a great example. I mean, their skier visits have like quadrupled since the early days, because they've become a destination where intermediate skiers are comfortable going to, and beginner skiers are comfortable going to. So sometimes you can make it work, and other times it's just the mountain is what it is, and it's all about celebrating. And that's what snowbird has done. They celebrate who they are, all the snow they get and the expert terrain and jumping off cliffs and tram, and that's their differentiator, and that's great. If they were to try to cater to intermediate skiers, they probably they would have limited success in doing that, and that's okay, because Alta, on the other hand, there's great intermediate terrain at Alta. So yeah, can't really change the core of the mountain.
So, Chris, I feel like there's I see this stat trotted out a lot, particularly from publications like the New York Times that don't necessarily write about skiing a lot. And they focus on the number of lost ski areas. So we don't have numbers before 1991 or two from the NSAA, but the number that we have from that era is around 550 ski areas. Now we have around 500. I keep my own count. The NSA keeps its own count. Our counts are slightly different, but they're around 500. Stabilized around the year 2000. I did an analysis last week, and it was in response to an article in an investing site that was talking about Vail Resorts and how we've lost all these resorts. We've lost like 50 resorts over the past 3 decades. And so they were saying there's less supply. Well, I did an analysis, and just looking at the 11 Western contiguous ski states in the U.S., so not Alaska, everything Colorado, Montana, north, and out to California, we've added 55,000 skiable acres of terrain since 1992. Okay, so that's the equivalent, and the current skiable acreage of Colorado, every resort in Colorado is 45,000 acres. So we've added more than an additional Colorado, and that is subtracting lost resorts and adding resorts like Tamarack and Blacktail, Montana, that came online. So curious from your point of view, one of the points I was trying to make with that article is, yes, we have fewer ski areas, but a lot of them were mismanaged. It's probably better to have fewer bigger areas, because then you have that expertise sort of concentrated and there's still a lot of consumer choice. Curious about your thoughts on that, as these mega passes do drive skiers, but we do see, big expansions of Steamboat and Aspen and Keystone. Is there a healthy rate of growth in the ski industry as far as available product is concerned? And is it better now than maybe having 600 ski areas back in 1982?
Really interesting question. I think that, I mean, there's certain markets that, I mean, clearly Utah, for example, is seeing huge growth, largely because of the accessibility, the ease of getting from the airport to the resorts. Um, Other things play a factor in that as well, of course, but that's kind of fundamental to it. And so, so I think, you know, providing additional terrain and capacity within the Utah market is kind of, I'll call it, responsible response to a situation that I mean, again, like I said earlier today, I haven't been skiing much at Snowbird and Alta this year because of the traffic issue, and I've been going up to Deer Valley, and I know I'm not alone. I don't know how many other people I've talked to. It's like, it's just not so. Snowbird and Alta have reached their practical limit in visitation for the day. They've hit that. People are. I'm not going there. I used to go there. I don't go there anymore. Well, I do, but so I think that's appropriate. The other thing too is that the Vales, the Park Cities, these resorts that are getting really inundated for various reasons are turning people off, and so when you look to Idaho and Montana and places that aren't they're a little bit more difficult to get to, but aren't seeing the level of crowding. I think that those resorts will and have seen increased use, and even the smaller resorts. We're doing some work at White Pine up in Pinedale, Wyoming, which is just this dinky little ski area. But they're going they want to kind of rekindle themselves, and so I think that kind of getting back to your question, adding terrain and capacity that addresses a demand in these kind of resort areas, I think is appropriate. If adding that capacity or that is going to exacerbate the situation, it's probably not appropriate. For example, well, no, I think I'm going to leave it at that. That's a really touchy subject because there's a lot of things that are happening that are causing challenges.
Well, let me give you my observation on Deer Valley. So I had the opportunity to ski that terrain a few weeks ago, and I've skied Deer Valley a bunch over the years. And the best part about the new terrain was that you didn't have to drive through Park City. You could just get off that highway and just park at that East Village, and they had a little shuttle, which was very nice. It was open air, it was easy. And it takes you over to this beautiful new six-pack lift, this Keeley Express, which is just gorgeous. Nice wind bubble. I happened to be there on a windy day, so it was nice. And just other lifts all over the place. And this is just a fraction of it. I really like that expansion for the capacity reason you said. I also like that it gives us an alternative to, when Deer Valley was conceived in 1980, I mean, Park City was a different place. And I don't think that they anticipated the traffic problems. But the hope here is that if you build it correctly, an expansion, and give people other ways to get there, I think that's probably a pretty big goal when you decide if there's going to be an expansion. I mean, that's my perception.
Yeah, no, and that's kind of what I was getting at is I don't think anyone would argue that the new East Village portal to Deer Valley is going to improve the traffic situation in Park City. Maybe not improve it, but it's not going to, it will allow the greater Park City area to absorb more people without causing additional traffic in town. And I think that's what really, that's where I go when I drive up from Salt Lake City. I go to the East Village because it's way easier. It's 10 minutes sooner because I don't have to drive through town. It's easier access to the lifts and so forth. And so that's great. It's addressing a traffic issue and or it's responsive to a traffic issue in Park City, um, and allowing for more visitation for the whole region without exacerbating an existing traffic situation.
So, talking about, I love what Deer Valley is doing. They're going to become the fourth largest ski area in the United States, or the fifth, and that's going to happen really, really fast. And they're adding that extra skier capacity. There's not that many places in America. Well, you really can't build new mountains. Here and there, when it'll come online, like Wasatch Peaks Ranch, and that's private, and that's an outlier. And we saw Tamarack come online in 2004, but it doesn't happen a lot anymore. On the other hand, you have resorts like Schweitzer, which 50 years ago was kind of a backwater, just little rinky-dink. Now it's a major resort, and Alterra bought it, and it has all these high-speed lifts. You pointed out another one earlier, Revelstoke, and Canada's filled with these Sun Peaks, Panorama, that were just a kicking horse, little local community bumps, and they built them up. I've been doing a lot of skiing the past few years in the upper Rockies, like Idaho, Montana, Eastern Washington, Oregon. There's a lot of little mountains out there that are not actually little. Like they're local places. They have a lot of old fixed grip lifts, but they could be major resorts. And I'm thinking of places like Silver Mountain, Idaho. It's right off I-90, like right there. And you take a gondola up, and it says it's amazing terrain, and they own it all, and they can do all these expansions. 49 degrees north in Washington, not quite as easy to get to, but just massive potential. And Idaho and Montana, especially, are just filled with these places. And you mentioned, White Pine, Wyoming, they have a bunch of smaller ski areas there. In your opinion, and maybe you can't talk about these, what do you think are the highest potential ski areas that could become our next Grand Targhee or Schweitzer, or even A Basin for that matter, where they were kind of a local little spot, but they really became something more just through some very smart planning, some upgrades to the lifts, a little more promotion, maybe when marketing and such. But did you have any spots on your radar? Kendall Mountain's another one out in Colorado that there's a big plans for, and it's right next to Silverton, but it's just this little 200 vertical foot thing. So are there any that you can tease us with that could be the one that everyone has to ski in 10 years, 20 years?
Well, access is so key, and if access is too good, like here, it can kind of create some issues. But if it's really challenging, that can be a problem as well. So Sun Valley is an example of it's decent, or Jackson, or Steamboat. But so I think that Tamarack has there's things happening at Tamarack.
Yeah, there's potential expansion onto federal land, because right now they're on state, right?
Correct. Yeah. So that could be something that's forthcoming. But Idaho and Montana, are the sleepers right now. And it's, great terrain up there. A lot of opportunities. Soldier Mountain is a really cool little mountain that's cut skied right now, but has some opportunity. And, I'll be honest that, there's nothing that is on my radar of places like, oh my God, this is the next big thing. But there's, like you mentioned, there's so many cool resorts up in Montana and Wyoming and Idaho that really could be really fun areas, and intimate, and kind of a little bit more relaxed than some of the bigger resorts, the Vales and Park Cities and Whistlers and things. Like you mentioned, like you pointed out, Revelstoke, Kicking Horse, those were little, local ski areas, and have evolved into, I would say major resort. I mean, they're big, but they're not doing, it's not like the masses are hoarding Kicking Horse and Revelstoke and Panorama. It's a really nice balance of excitement and energy, but not too much, and I think that's what we're kind of lacking down here in the U.S. is some of those bigger resorts that I mean, Sun Valley is very low key from a visitation perspective, and there are resorts out there that even Big Sky is not. At least, I mean, it's kind of changing, but I was there a couple of years ago, and they had all the new lifts and everything, and it really wasn't super crowded like you'd see in Colorado or here in Utah, in California, and other places. So I think, yeah, again, I don't really have any crystal ball on where some of those things might happen, but my sense is, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, they've kind of got what it takes to get there, and yeah, that's
Yeah, they do, and they have some really interesting facilities pretty near interstates. Like I was up at Great Divide, Montana, and that's a really cool ski area. They have all double chairs, riblets, but it had really approachable terrain, really fun terrain, really expansive. Montana Snowball is another one. It's yeah, the access road is rough, but it's right off I-90. So there's a ton. I was at this little place, Magic Mountain in Idaho, a few weeks ago, and it's tough to get to, but you get there and it's so fun. And they have so much terrain in their permit area, but they told me they can't afford any infrastructure. So, I'm always thinking about this and dreaming of what it could be when I'm there. And obviously you are too, because this is your whole career. So leave me with this today, Chris. My point of view, the way that I approach ski areas is almost as a public park, right? I've lived in New York City for a long time. And when you go to Central Park, it's filled with tourists. It looks like this natural splendor. It's not. It's a piece of art by Frederick Law Olmsted that he created this 880-acre park for us all to enjoy. And you can wander and explore, and it's magnificent. I feel the same way when I go to Vail Mountain or Snowmass or really any ski area. It's a group of humans crafted this piece of art, this park, for us to enjoy and engage in nature in a unique way. So it's not really going back to nature. If you want to do that, there's plenty of ways to do that. It's more finding this really cool meshing of the human and the natural and this like artistic spirit, and we get to express ourselves through it. That's my point of view. Maybe that's too fluffy for some people. Curious from your point of view, if that aesthetic piece of it is important to you, and as you're designing and envisioning new paths for mountains, and if it is, how you balance that with the practical, right? Because you want to build these skier bridges at Killington, but you want them to be elegant and nice, and you want people to feel, even though Killington is almost like a borough of New York City, and it's wild and it's crazy and it's frantic and the energy is amazing, you still want people to feel like they're up in the Green Mountains. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, and if this is part of your thinking, if there's an artistic aesthetic piece of this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. And that's one of the things that, my dad really taught me is, sort of the artistic aesthetic end of things. And that comes in the form of, making trails so you can't see from the top to the bottom, but there's discovery around every corner, or leaving islands of evergreens in the middle of the trail, or providing roles and things that I mean, I really appreciate your your kind of outlook on things, and we're really helping the general public access nature. I mean, by having ski resorts, it's helping the public access public lands in the case of national forests, or just getting out into nature. And actually at Steamboat, when we were doing the Pony Express expansion area, the forester was very interested in making sure that it looked, it wasn't like trails just cut down the mountain. And we went through great efforts to use, aspen trees grow in clones, and the different clones have a different shade of leaves and things. And so we would identify the clones, and we'd clear the runs to follow those clone edges and things like that. And there's just
Sorry to
so
interject,
many ways.
but Pony is one of my favorite terrain pods in Colorado. I
Cool.
just want to say
Awesome.
that I've skied most of them. It is such a cool experience. So mission accomplished.
Thank you. The irony of that, though, is that we went through these painstaking efforts to kind of make this mosaic of tree islands and things like that. And that summer, there was a fire, and right near the top of the mountain, it's kind of a big open clear area now. And a lot of those the trees that we left and to make this mosaic burned down, which is a bummer. But it's still achieved the same thing. So yeah, no, absolutely. The aesthetic is, for me, it's very important for me, and I really do everything I can to have that creative component to what we do.
And of all the projects you worked on, are there standouts, ones where you say, yeah, we really nailed it with that one?
I think Steamboat is, Pony Express and what's it called? Mahogany Ridge. I think that, of course, that's not, Mahogany Ridge is more glades anyway, but I think that came out really well. Tamarack, actually, I'm quite proud of that, because like when you're on the highway 55 across the lake and you look across the Tamarack, you can barely see it. It really, and the guy that was the developer back in the day, this guy Alfredo Miguel, who was the main developer, or one of the main developers behind the project, and he came up to me and goes, "Oh, Chris, you did such a great job. Most years it looks like a bear took his claws and clawed down the mountain, and this doesn't look like that." And so I think Tamarack came out really well from that perspective, and it's really fun terrain too. So
good stuff, Chris. Look, I'm really excited about what you're doing at Deer Valley, but it sounds like there's so much going on in skiing. I hope that folks listening to this feel optimistic about the future of where we're heading, and understand that there is a very deliberate process around developing mountains. It's not just about let's put in the biggest lift and pump the most people up the mountain. It's about creating experience. So thank you so much for laying all that out for us, Chris. I should have done it sooner. I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Really great chatting with you, Stuart. And yeah, let's do it again sometime.
All right, that was Chris Cushing, Principal of Mountain Planning at SE Group. I meant what I said at the beginning. That could have been episode 1 of the Storm Skiing Podcast. And if you're new here, you should probably just start there. That was so awesome, Chris. It basically tied together everything that I talk about all the time in the Storm Skiing newsletter, which you will all want to subscribe to at stormskiing.com. The podcast, much as I love it, is just a small part of the storm. I am talking about breaking down, analyzing, lift-served skiing all year long, and I would love to have you along. You can also follow the Storm on X, Instagram, and YouTube at Storm Ski Journal. Until next time, stay well, stay safe. I'm Stuart Winchester, and I will talk to you again very soon.
The Storm Skiing Podcast is a Quicksilver Films production.